Hi, I'm Rory, and with me, as always, is Ken. How are you doing today, Ken?
I'm well. Thank you very much for asking, Rory. Rory and I are so grateful that you've joined us for the Counselling Tutor Podcast. You've caught us at episode 245. We've got 3 topics that we're going to be looking at today, starting off with our theory and practice, where we take an element of theory and we look at how does that present itself in real life counselling sessions. And today we're going to be speaking about the stages of counselling. We then move on to practice partner. That's the section where we recognise that many go into private practice, run a private practice, or wish to start a private practice. And we speak about some of the elements of setting up and running a private practice. We then move on to practice matters. And I think, well, hold on, before we move on to practice matters, Rory, I'm just going to say what we're going to be covering in practice partner. Today, we're going to be speaking about tools. So it's digital tools that you would use online. And we're talking about tools that would automate your processes. Then we move on to practice matters. I love practice matters because that's an area where we get an expert in to tell us how it is for them. And we look at an element of practice, something that might come up within our own practice, or maybe just having a look at how it is for somebody else within their practice. And that's what today's kind of theme is. We've got Carley Symes. Rory met up with Carley, and she speaks about what it's like to be a young counsellor in today's world. How is she perceived? She's going to be sharing that with us today. So episode 245, Rory, starting off with those stages in counselling. How do they show themselves in our counselling room?
Well, I think this is a very interesting topic in terms of applying a theory to practice. And if I could take you back in time, Ken, to when you did your introduction course, sometimes it's called a level 2 here in the UK or here in England. When we started off our counselling skills, we usually asked just to sit with a partner and just practice listening skills. There's no stages in it. It's just a case of getting used to listening more than you speak, and to be able to really tune into someone, to start that empathic attunement that is so important in counselling. And then as we move through our training, we begin to realise that it's not just a case of sitting and listening. There's actually a active structure to counselling skills, using counselling skills, whether you are just using them as skills or if you're using them as a counsellor. And those are stages. And the reason we have stages in a counselling encounter is so that a therapist can manage the time allocated and can not direct, but can put a structure in place that the client can work within. So both the client and the counsellor works within it. And those are called stages. And a very simple stage to look at is beginnings, middles, and end. And if you're doing your kind of level 3 or your certificate in counselling, as our good friends in Scotland do, it might be that you start off with a contract so that the person knows exactly what they're getting, and the time allocated, and confidentiality, and that this is the space for them. And then you start off with that, so people know exactly what they're getting. And then you move through that place where people are talking about, what's on their mind, and you may be using skills of silence, attending, reflecting and paraphrasing, active listening skills. And then as the hour or the time allocated in that one session comes to an end, you're then looking at ending, giving someone some time or a time indication. There's a few minutes left so that the ending isn't abrupt and they don't feel cut off or discounted. And then eventually you end the session, and that's the end of the arc of that therapy. And then when you go into level 4, that extends because you're using that not just in one session with a client, but through a series of sessions with a client, beginnings, middles, and endings, Ken.
It's interesting. And I like the way that you've kind of drawn attention to that, Rory, that Yes, we can say, of course, there's a beginning, a middle, and an end in every single session we have with the client. But there's also, if we take the group of sessions, so all of the sessions we might have with that client, we're also going to track the beginning, middle, and ending within that as well in the stages of counseling. And for me, it's the beginning bit makes a lot of sense, because a beginning, if you think about a film, if you think about a book, if you think about a new relationship or a new friend that you might meet, there's going to be a process of getting to know who they are and them getting to know who you are. So if we were reading a good book, they would be defining the characters. They'd be giving us a bit of the character's background, and they wouldn't be going too much into the meat of the story. They would be kind of giving us a reference. And the same is true when we're counseling. We need to, I guess, consider, if we're looking at the beginning stage of counseling, and the beginning stage, if we're looking at an arc of sessions, could be 2, 3, could even be 4 sessions, depending on who that client is and how that relationship feels within the therapy room. And within that beginning phase, as you've already said, Rory, we're going to be doing the paperwork and the housekeeping, as it were, in terms of our contracting. And we do that, as we've spoken so many times before, to kind of level the playing field so that that client understands what we understand. You know, they understand the arena in which we are working, what the boundaries look like. So that's part of that beginning. But then when we look at the counseling skills that we might use in that beginning phase, we are, as you've called them out already, Rory, we're using active listening. We are showing that we are there and that we are attentive to the person who's bringing their materials, keeping in mind it kind of could be quite nerve-wracking for them in those early sessions, coming in, meeting a complete stranger, and then kind of being expected to bring parts of their lives, maybe difficult or challenging parts of their lives. We're there to build that relationship, to build the trust, and it's called rapport. We are doing rapport building within those early stages, and great skills, skill of silence, as you've said, non-verbal communication, showing that you're listening, leaning your body in, eye contact when it is appropriate, reflection, just reflecting back what they're bringing to you, paraphrasing. And what do these skills do? Well, they instill in the speaker that is coming to us that they are being heard. They're being heard. If we're paraphrasing back and we're choosing an emotion or something that they may have brought that's important to them, we're not just parroting, we are paraphrasing, or we are reflecting back, and they're hearing it and they're going, wow, this person is really listening to me. They really get me. And that is what builds the trust. It breaks those barriers that we have in everyday life where we're kind of quite guarded as we go out there. And it's a really important part of the counseling journey. And I guess in the same way as within a new relationship, Rory, let's say I met somebody and I thought, oh, that's quite an attractive person. It would be pretty inappropriate for me to, after 2 drinks, to say, you know what, I think we should get married. I really think we should get married. It's too much and it's far too soon. It doesn't belong in the beginning phase of a relationship. And similarly, within the beginning phase of a counseling session, there are certain skills that we might either not use or use with reservation and skill as a mature therapist, maybe. But we would maybe try to avoid high challenge in those early stages, because that client, being so delicate in those early stages, could easily fracture, run away. Wow, okay, hold on, I feel very challenged here, and that could kind of get them to take a step back, Rory.
Absolutely, Ken. And I like that you've talked about the appropriate use of skills through the arc of an engagement, because you're absolutely spot on. You know, the skills you'd use in a more mature 5, 6, 7 sessions in maybe are going to be slightly different to those in the early stages. And you touched on the role of challenge. Challenge it should only be used, I think, when the relationship is built, there's trust there, you sort of know each other. And even then, I think it has to be used quite kind of sparingly and with a lot of thoughtfulness, because that can be kind of real. Well, you know, challenge, the clue's in the name, it's challenging. to the client. And one skill that we've yet to discuss, of course, is summarising, because as we move to the end of a session, we summarise. It's a longer paraphrase, and that allows the client to have something to take away with them. That's going to be fresh on their mind as they leave the therapy room or leave the engagement. And that allows for something that's often unspoken, I think, in therapy. And that is that they have something to take away and reflect on through the week. And how often, Ken, have we heard as practitioners, clients coming back to us, on maybe a subsequent session, who say, at the end of last session, you kind of summed up and you said to me, they usually say, you've said to me, and I've been thinking about this and I'm not sure if that's right, or actually you've got a point there. Yeah. And that's sometimes where the majority of work is done. And I think that managing the arc of a session is really important to allow the client to have something to think about, to reflect on in between. And when it comes to skills, so if you're listening to this and you've got to make a recording for your tutor, it's really important that you show a wide range of skills. The awarding bodies usually say a minimum or a maximum of skills. Some awarding bodies do, some awarding bodies don't. So you're actually demonstrating your use of skills, but also a skillful beginning and a skillful end. And when you come to write your assignment, you're almost certainly going to be asked, why is it important to have a beginning? Why is it important to have a middle? What are you going to be doing in the middle of that session? Why is it important to have an ending? And, it's important to have a beginning because everything has to begin somewhere. I'm always reminded, Ken, when we start counselling, it's a bit like an opening curtain of a theatre where you open and, you are on the stage with your clients, and I'm not suggesting that you're acting, but there is that kind of tenseness, if you like, of where's this going? Who are we going to be? What is the relationship going to look like? Which direction are we going to travel? Neither of us know that until we begin. And then you begin with the contract that says to the client, this is what I can offer. These are the limits of confidentiality. This is how you're welcomed here in the room. And then it begins. And then you move through looking at that difficult material, being thoughtful, being curious, maybe in some cases, using questions sparingly. And as the session comes to an end, because we don't want sessions to go on for 3 or 4 hours, we're looking at the time, we say, just got about 10 minutes left. And I've got about 10 minutes left. And that helps the client then think about the ending and the fact that they're going to have to leave the therapy room. Really, really important. And I don't think I can speak about endings without thinking about some of the rookie errors that I made. Certainly I made as a student, which was you get to the end and you say we just come to the end now, and then you say to the person who's the client, if it's one of your colleagues or the person you're helping, you say, is there anything else I can help you with? And you go, well, actually, I've got this other problem, and you've come to the end of the session. Yeah. And the students I taught, we had a lot of fun with that because they say, well, what do I do now? And I said, well, clearly, when it comes to the end, just let the end come and then just disengage, because obviously if you ask someone if there's anything else, they may very well likely say that. So it is a skill in itself, managing that arc, managing the kind of theatre, for want of a better phrase, of therapy, beginning, middle, and end. And like everything we do, it's in service of the client, Ken.
It is. And you're speaking about this and speaking about if you're a student and if you're doing recordings or if you're working with your peers. But similarly, if you're a seasoned practitioner, maybe the challenge here is to revisit that beginning, middle, and end. Maybe have a look at your caseload and ask yourself the question, where am I at with this client? Where am I at with this client? Where am I at with this client? Am I in the beginning phase, the middle phase, or the ending phase? When we're looking at a session independently, it kind of makes sense, and it still needs to be managed carefully and professionally, the beginning, the middle, and the end, as Rory has just said, and that kind of reflecting against all of the sessions that we might have with that person. And I was thinking, you've spoken about the end. I just want to visit the middle for a bit. And first of all, how might we know that we're in that middle phase? How might we know that we might use those more advanced skills, such as immediacy, challenge, asking more open questions of this client. And a great indicator for myself is looking at the client themselves and seeing how they appear and how they present themselves in your therapy room. You know, you may see in the very beginning they might be quite nervous. You notice their hands are maybe ringing. They don't know where to put their hands. They might use words like, well, I'm a little bit nervous. I've never told anybody this. I don't know how to tell you this. I don't know if I should. That's the kind of language that we might see in that beginning phase when we're building that trust, where we're being gentle and being more of a listener and feeding back that we hear. We're working with very, very deep levels of empathy and showing that we truly understand in that beginning phase. That's what we might see within the client. We may see it in their body language. They may shun away from us. They may sit facing away from us. They may cross their arms. So we're really open to that body language. So that's what we might see as a presentation for we're in the beginning phases. And that can be one session. It can be 3 sessions. It depends who that client is. It is that idiosyncratic relationship in that it's different with each. So we can't say on session 3, now we're in the middle. Even if there's 6 sessions, it does not necessarily mean that at session 3, you're now you may have a client who needs more gentleness in those early. And there's sometimes that we get to the end of 6 sessions, which were allocated, where we need to plan further journey for this client because they're not at the point that they feel well served at that stage. So then when we move into that middle phase, what might we see? Well, we might see a more relaxed client. We might see them settling down in the chair, being more open. We might see them talking and moving their hands to kind of indicate what's going on for them, as opposed to holding their hands clenched. So they might be less mindful of how they are holding their body. They might turn more into us. They might make more eye contact. And of course, these are all mights. It depends on who that person is. There's not a checklist that indicates that they are in the middle, but we're looking for the signs of this. And a really good sign for me is when a client comes in and speaks in a more free manner, and you kind of alluded it to it, Rory. You might do a summary at the end of a session. The client may go away and they may come in, and if they come in and they're going, you said last week, and we were talking about last week, and I've noticed in my dealings this week, and blah, 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 and you can see they're on a roll. They're going there. That trust is built. They're now here, and they are freely sharing who they are within this threat-free environment that we've created in the opening, in those beginning phases. We're now in the middle. We're in the place where we're going to really delve deep into the material. We're going to maybe use more questions. We're maybe going to use immediacy, where we bring how we might feel about something into the session. And I think that's an important phase of the counseling. It's where a lot of the work is done. And of course, then we need to recognize that there is an ending. And if we have open sessions that go on forever, and of course there are many that have been in therapy, maybe psychotherapy, for many years, 10 years, 15 years, and continue to go on a weekly basis. There we would just acknowledge the ending of each session. But if we do have a set ending, we would be acknowledging that ending within that middle session. Well, we'd do it firstly in the beginning when we're setting the contract, but we would also do it during the middle session, just acknowledging the ending of all of the sessions. And then if we don't have a cap, 6 sessions, so we've got flexibility in that, we might acknowledge the ending when a client starts to show that they have developed, that they have changed, that they have got what they initially came in for. They might come in and their initial presentation is, I'm really struggling with this. I'm hoping to get over that. And we might get to a point where we're going, I recognize when you came in, you mentioned that you were really struggling with X, and what you've just shared in today's session suggests that's really loosening up for you. And I can't help but recognizing that that's what you came in for. And perhaps this is an indicator that we may be coming to the end of our times together, because we don't want to create that dependence. And then we would go into the ending where a lot of, within the ending, we would be recognize the ending is coming. We would be summarizing not just the session we're in, but maybe the sessions we've had together. When you came in, it was like this, and then we worked through this, and then you had this breakthrough, and now we're at this place. And I wonder, as we come to the end now, where you might be going forward and what that looks like for you. Raw.
Yeah, absolutely, Ken. And I like the fact that you've spoken about long-term engagements, because in a long-term engagement, as a therapist, I think one needs to not become complacent. Because at the beginning of therapy, I think there's quite an intensity. At the beginning of the engagement, you and your client are sat opposite each other trying to work out who you are. And then as the arc of therapy starts to form and you go into that middle piece, you're getting a good idea of who you are. And the client is getting a good idea of who you are, to be honest, because you're building a relationship. And it's really important, I think, to stay tuned into the client, to keep that empathic attunement. And I think, in my experience, it can be easy to drift a little bit. That's why good supervision is important, because my supervisor said to me on more than one occasion, what's happening in this relationship, Rory? And if you can't work out where you are and where the client may be, are you actually, to want for a better phrase, in the game? Are you connected? Are you in tuned to the client? And I think you're absolutely right. There is a bit of a debate whether we shouldn't be making ourselves redundant or not, and I think that really relies on the client. But we have to balance that out with autonomy. We don't want to keep people in therapy longer than they need to be, especially if it's paid therapy. There's an ethical dimension to that. So, I think you're right. We should be listening for signs that the client has got what they came for. And also the fact that, they're now able to be autonomous people and go out into the world. If we're thinking of person-centered kind of methodology, the idea that they're self-actuated, they've harnessed their own actualizing tendency. So we must be very careful in that middle piece to stay attuned, to really work with the clients and not kind of get, complacent and say, oh, well, they're going to be talking about this week. And no, that's not right. They're going to be talking about something that's really important to them, and you need to be in with them. And I think it's a fascinating topic, the arc of therapy. And, Ken, it's something that comes up in our Facebook group quite a lot, which is why I put it into the podcast today. And if you're not a member of our Facebook group, if you go to Facebook, type in Counselling Tutor, you'll find us. We're a closed group. If you knock on the door, our moderators will let you in and can join thousands and thousands of like-minded people talking about the world of counselling and psychotherapy, students. There's qualified colleagues. There's also supervisors and tutors. And there's huge debates goes on about really interesting topics. And I have to say, the arc of therapy comes up more often than not, Ken.
Yeah, thanks for that, Rory. There's also a super duper handout. Go to counsellingtutor.com, click on the podcast tab. It's episode 245. Rory has prepared a handout for you that you can download free of charge on the stages of counselling. It's really worth having those, popping them in a file, whether you're a student to reflect back on when you do your assignments or your recorded skill sessions. But if you're a qualified therapist, these are really good base theories that are really worth revisiting. As I said before, if you have a caseload, maybe the challenge is where are my clients? When you've got somebody in the room with you, are they in the beginning, middle, or ending phase? And am I serving them in the best way within the phase that I see that they are in? And of course, it's great to take into supervision. I've got this client, and I can still see on session 3 they still seem to be in that forming, that beginning stage. They seem timid. It's really a rich area to delve into. The skills we use within the arc of those sessions, so important. If you've listened to the Counselling Tutor podcast before, and Rory and I, you're going to know that I love skills. I wrote the book, Basic Counselling Skills, a student guide, which is recommended reading on so many training providers. And I've also created a little personal project called Counselling Skills Academy. And what we've built on there is 6 full sessions. They're real sessions of client and counselor material, and it beautifully matches the arc of beginning, middle, and end. The counsellor there is Sally Ann. She is absolutely amazing. She holds a master's degree. She's been counselling for many years. She's a clinical supervisor. We contracted to be able to use this information for educational purposes. So that's counsellingskillsacademy.com, who incidentally are the sponsors of Theory in Practice. And as we move out of theory to practice, we go to our practice partner. And today, our practice partner, we are looking at automation tools, Rory. So if we're running a therapy practice, what is an automation tool?
Well, I think that's a very good point. And if we look at if we look at very basic automation tools, one of them may be a email responder, where someone emails to you and says, "Have you got a vacancy?" They may email you at 3:00 in the morning, as happens, and instead of the email just sitting there waiting in your inbox for a reply, you have an automatic response that says, "Thank you for getting in contact. I'm not available at the moment, but I will come back to you as soon as possible." And, that defeats to some extent that black hole effect that we sometimes talk about in therapy, where someone sends an email and then they just sit waiting for a response. And I think on a very basic level, Ken, that is probably a good starting point for automation. Just have an email responder that responds instantly to somebody when you're not about, or even when you're in the office, because they get an email and then they get a follow up, and within that, you can put useful information in. You can talk about, if you're in the UK, the Samaritans, or maybe put in if you're in crisis, contact 999, and you've given back something. You've given some value back to that person. You've proved, even though you're not present, that you're caring, you're thinking about them. I think it goes a long way with people to get a response back as quick as possible, Ken.
Yeah, if you think about where is a client when they make that initial outreach, we might look at it and go, "Oh, I have another inquiry to get back to." But behind that another inquiry to get back to is a real person who may have gone through a series of thinking and resistance before they built up the courage to even look online to try and find a counselor, or found a pamphlet or a business card, or however they got to you. That reaching out is a massive, massive step, not for everybody, but for many. And I think, we've spoken before in previous instances of practice partner, looking at the stages of setting up a private practice, that one of the best techniques to getting new clients is getting back to them. And we spoke about some experiences we've had where we've contacted counselors and supervisors and never heard back. And think about what that might mean to that person. I finally plucked up the courage to reach out, and then I don't hear back. You've said it, Rory, that black hole effect. Am I not even worth listening to? Can be the feeling that is left with that person. An autoresponder is what it is called, an autoresponder. So it responds automatically. If you use Microsoft, you can set up an out of office autoresponder. So when you're not there, you're not able to manage your mailbox, it will automatically respond. If you have a paid use of Gmail, so Google's free mail service is Gmail, but you can pay, which gives you additional things that you can do with that, and you can set up an autoresponder on those. And then you can, of course, buy autoresponder email clients. Like one of them is called MailChimp, which is very well known, and that would automatically email. And there's many different instances of that, and we're not recommending any at all. That's not the purpose of this. We're just saying certain names just as examples here. So that initial email, so somebody sends an email, the autoresponder says, when an email comes in, send this email out. And you might do exactly that, Rory. I'm the client, I send an email, and within a minute, I've got an email back saying, "Hey, thank you so much for reaching out. I've received your email. I'm not able to get back to you 100% now. I want to take some time to read over what you've sent in, and I will respond to you within 24 hours or whatever your time frame is." Now the person sending that email, that client reaching out, has that instant recognition. And as Rory said, you might say something at the back, at the bottom of that email, like, if you are really struggling, you have an emergency right now and you need to speak to somebody, here's the link for the Samaritans, or whatever the emergency service might be, that people can talk and get somebody to listen to them within your country or your jurisdiction. So that is the autoresponder. Now, we can't talk about autoresponders without visiting episode 244 of the Counselling Tutor Podcast, where we spoke about GDPR and the processing of data. Even a simple autoresponder is processing data automatically. So it would need to be in your privacy policy, because you're not humanly sitting sending a reply. It's an automation. It's a bit of software that is replying. So you would want to be mentioning that you were using MailChimp or whatever the mail client that you use within your privacy policy. It's just worth doing that. And any automation tool would be mentioned within your privacy policy, because it is taking data and automating it. So there is an example of technology or a tool that you can use online. And then another one might be something to get your contract signed. So you might send a contract. You've now met up with the client and they've said that they want to work with you, and you send a contract. How does the client get that back to you? How do they sign it and get it back to you? And of course, we could go snail mail, where they have to make a trip to the post office, pay for a stamp, put it in an envelope. But there are tools, automation tools that we can use now, where you can send a contract to the person. That person can digitally sign that, and that is lawful. So in other words, when I say lawful, it would stand up in a court of law that they agreed to that contract. The way that it is tracked, it has a way of kind of validating itself. And now an example of that is DocuSign. And again, I'm just using that as a keyword that you might search if you were looking for a tool. We do not recommend any automation tool, but I think that is a relatively new development, Rory. Just a few years ago, there wasn't a way of validating acceptance of something like a contract online.
No, absolutely right. And, one of the lessons that we took away from the pandemic, when practitioners, flooded into the online environment, was that, how do you exchange your contracts? And now the legacy of that is that I think a lot of people, even if they're doing face-to-face work, still may send a contract by email, and for it to be signed. I think it's done, it's generated an area of good practice where you may send the contracts in advance of meeting the client. Clients inquired, you may have had a discovery call or a discovery meeting, and then you can send the contract after that, which means that the client has seen it before they come to therapy, which means you're not taking time up on that for valuable first session. Talk about the contract. You can say, obviously you've seen the contract, we signed it, and you know about the confidentiality. Yes. With that in mind, then you can move into the client's material. You're not wasting the client's time. And I think another area of automation, Ken, is people who use practice management software. So, for instance, if you use a practice management software, a software that may store your notes, may have built-in video feed, when you are making your next appointment with the client, you just click on your calendar, and that's automatically sent to the client's mailbox. And that's really, really useful. Again, we live in a contemporary society where people expect this. It happens in other areas of work or business where it's fairly instantaneous. If you buy something, you get an email response. Yeah. Or, even if I go to my doctor now, I book my doctor's appointment on a computer screen, and they drop me an email in my email box and say, this is the time you have to turn up. And, therapists are now, using practice management software to be able to send emails. It's very important. And again, you're absolutely right, Ken. It's about limits of confidentiality and making sure the client understands that's the process that you're using.
Yeah, and you're speaking about practice management tools. We wouldn't be able to pass that by without telling you about Therapy Lock. So Therapy Lock is the practice management tool that was built by Counselling Tutor, and it does all of this that we're talking about today, as well as holding GDPR compliant data, your notes, which are stored encrypted, and basically keeping your practice and your clients safe. And if you're interested in looking at Therapy Lock, go to counsellingtutor.com, and the information is right there on the homepage. But in terms of appointment reminders, so we spoke about the autoresponder, that automatically responding to an email when it comes in. A little advancement on that is the ability to send reminders and updates. So you've just been speaking about them now, Rory, in terms of if I have an appointment with my dentist, it might be 3 months. The dentist might say, I'll see you in 3 months' time. And in 3 months' time, I get a text from the dentist saying, hey, remember your appointment's coming up. Same if I go and see a doctor, I'm going to get a text saying, reminding me of the time and date of my appointment. And yes, that can be managed by practice management software, but you can also manage it via tools that are available. Autoresponders, if you use that as a keyword, you can set up autoresponders. But there again, you are dealing with client data. So if you are looking for a tool to serve you in your business, to automatically reply to your emails, to maybe send reminders, you want to be checking where are they based, how do they process data, and where is that data stored, and how safe is that data? Because it is sensitive client data. You've got their name, you've got maybe some details about them, you've got their a date and time that they're going to be meeting with you as a counselor. That's quite a lot of person's information that is stored by a company. So always be looking, if you're choosing automation tools, at how, not just what they do. Yes, what they do is important, but how do they manage and store the data? In what country does the company run that manages this tool for you? Where are their data centers? Where are they stored? What are the laws that govern that data? And I very recently chose not to join something that I was looking at, Rory. It was a little bit of software, nothing related to counseling and psychotherapy. But as I was going through the process of joining up, one of the things that I noticed was that the data centers where my data was going to be held was in the US of A. And I live in the UK, and the data laws and the protection laws in the UK are very different to the US of A, where data is I guess, more loosely managed. And I wasn't happy with my data sitting in on a US server, and they were asking for some sensitive data. It was a health tracking app. It was what I eat and how much exercise I do, and I don't want that data being viewed by anyone. That's my personal stuff, you know. Yeah. Not my weight. I don't want anybody knowing about that. So I choose not to join that because it has a US data center. But you need to look for yourself. You know, if you go to a practice management tool that is run by a reputable company, then that support, I guess, and the legalities of that should be built in for you.
Absolutely, Ken. You know, and I think it just speaks to the fact that in a increasingly technological society, therapists aren't immune from having to kind of do that work. You know, I've heard a lot of therapists say, I'm a therapist, not a computer person. And, you know, I have a lot of sympathy with that. Unfortunately, we are more technologically connected than ever. And, you know, if you are using any technology, if you're using a form on a website, if you're, as I say, if you're using an email responder, anything like that, practice management software like TherapyLock, you know, you will come under, if you're certainly in the UK and certainly in Europe, slightly different in Europe, but the same principle applies, general data protection regulations. And I think there's one area that we've not actually covered, but it's probably something that's used more than we probably consider, and that's the phone, Ken. A lot of people would phone us up, make a phone call. And here again, it's about the autoresponder, and that is the answering machine. All phones have an answering machine. In fact, I can remember when phones didn't have an answering machine. That makes me very old, really. But, you know, when the phone rang, you used to pick it up and go, who's that? Because you never knew. But in terms of mobile phones, you have an answering machine. What message are you going to put on to your mobile phone? And I think one of the best ones I heard was from a therapist friend of mine. And, you know, he says, you know, I'm not available at the moment. I know your message is important. Please leave your name and number, and I will come back to you as soon as possible. And just that validation of, I know your message is important, is so important, because it says, yes, it is. And I will leave a message, as opposed to saying, oh, I'm not here at the moment, or that dreaded ring out, and a robotic voice says, leave your name and number after the beep. And I don't know about you, Ken, but the phone's usually switched off by that time.
Yeah.
Yeah.
You're looking for a kind, warm voice of the therapist to welcome you if you're going to be using your phone as a medium of contact. And of course, and that's why Rory and I recommend, if you're setting up in private practice, you would not want to be using your personal mobile phone for your incoming and client work and messaging. It's part of the considerations. I mean, it's your consideration because it's your practice that you're setting up, but you don't want to be answering your phone in a more relaxed manner when it might be a client. You want to be serving them and know when that phone rings, that is a client, and then you can put an appropriate message on. Just one more thing on the automatic reply on a mobile phone is to consider an alternate means of communication for that client who is reaching out. And the reason for that is they may choose not to leave their number. They may be in a difficult situation where a phone call to them at an inappropriate time might raise questions and might kind of out them to have reached out to somebody. Many times that's not the case. And if it's not the case, the person will leave their name and their number and you will be able to call them back. But you can also say, if you would rather me contact you via email, you can email me at, and you might use a webmail address that they can send an email privately. So webmail is things like Hushmail, and there are a number of those mailing services where the person doesn't have to send it from their own email client. It's useful when you're working with vulnerable client groups. And then, of course, we wouldn't speak about automation without speaking about invoicing and payments, because this is the age of taking payments online, face-to-face in a room with a client. Chances are, when I was in practice, Rory, it was most often cash in an envelope that was handed to me. And we move more and more to a cashless society where I was at a craft fair just this weekend, and buying honey and jam and scented candles was touching my phone against the machine of the person standing in the middle of a field with a tent over them. And I was wondering at the technology, and there are ways of sending invoices and collecting payments online. Again, have a look who the provider is. Who is that provider and how is the data being stored? So there are bookkeeping software that you could use to send an invoice. Who's seeing that? Is your accountant seeing all your clients' names? It's just that extra level of thinking. If you're taking an envelope in your counseling room, hey ho, it's between you and that person. And what we're looking to do, I guess, with any automation is make it between us and that person as much as we can. And where it is not, giving the client the information of how their data is stored and used and where it is stored and used in compliance with the laws of your country, which is covered in depth, as I've said, in episode 244. It's interesting that when we speak about going into private practice, building a private practice, expanding a private practice, Rory, that we keep on coming back to this data protection and how data is stored and managed.
Absolutely, Ken. And it is now become the centre to some extent of private practice, and I think every element of our life. A few years ago, nobody was speaking about personal data. They just pop onto a form and send information and personal information, and how many hot dogs you eat, and all that would go. And nowadays, people are looking and thinking, well, who's going to view this? Why would someone want to know how many hot dogs that I eat? And the general public are becoming more and more wary. There's been a huge amount of public information on this. The banks have, every time I log into my bank app, I get a long lecture on being very careful and, looking over my shoulder before I touch any buttons and all that type of thing. And the law has become a lot more stringent. Data is seen as something that could really, used incorrectly, could really disadvantage somebody, seriously disadvantage somebody. So if you are a private practitioner, it has to be at the heart of your practice. And you're right, Ken, it touches so many areas. It touches your reach out, it touches your storages of notes, it touches your invoicing, your communications. There's not one area of practice where data protection doesn't feature.
notes and storage. It's all there. It falls under a legislation that maybe wasn't around just a few short years ago. And that is the changing face of private practice these days, specifically if you are working online or you're blended working, maybe a combination of online and face-to-face in the room. And again, just a shout out, if you want the heavy lifting done for you, practice management software developed by counsellors for counsellors, where legislation, confidentiality, privacy, and simplicity of use are at the very heart. Then check out Therapy Lock, and you can check that out at counsellingtutor.com. There it is. That is our practice partner for today. We now move on to Practice Matters, where we look at an element of practice. Today, we're peeking into somebody else's practice, which I love doing. It's like opening the curtains, where I always feel like I've got a sneaky, secret view of someone else's practice when you do interviews like this. Because, Rory, you reached out, you spoke to Carley Symes about what it's like to be a young counsellor. And I know there are many out there, maybe students or maybe recently graduates that maybe consider themselves young counsellors. How is it out there in the real world?
Absolutely, Ken. And what prompted me to do this interview, I was doing a little bit of reading, and I came up with an article from Ali Xavier, published in the BACP website on 2020. It's called Playing the Numbers Game, and it talked about the data of and the demographic data of counsellors. And they were saying that in 2019, the average counsellor is middle-aged or older. Less than 20% of BACP members are under 45, around 30% are 45 to 54, 33.5 are 55 to 64, and nearly 15% are over 65. But it does beg the question for people like us, Ken. We came to be practicing therapists after 2, 3, or in my case, even 4 careers. But younger therapists are making it their first career. Yep. It's an out of university career, and I think that it's a disservice not to speak to at least one person who is walking that path. So I caught up with Carley Symes, and she shared with me about her experiences of being a young therapist, and this is what she had to say. And we welcome Carley Symes, who is joining us today. Hello, Carley, to discuss her experiences of being a younger counsellor. The demographic of counsellors in terms of age is reducing. There's more younger members of our society wanting to join the helping professions. So I met up with Carley just to get a sense of her experiences of training and being a younger counsellor. So Carley, thank you so much for joining us.
You are welcome.
So can I ask, if a gentleman can ask these kind of questions, how old you are?
I'm 29 at the moment.
You're 29. You're 29. And how old were you when you started training to be a therapist, to be a counsellor?
When I started my actual counselling training on top of my degree I was 22 at that point.
Right, okay.
I was a lot younger than the rest of the people on the course.
So when you started your counselling journey, in terms of moving into practice, maybe working in a placement, you were 22. Wow. Mm-hmm. So what was your experience of being a younger therapist in terms of that initial training?
It was actually pretty good. I was definitely the youngest on my level 2 by quite a considerable amount. But I had I was very fortunate actually, because I've spoken to some of my other peers through the Young Persons Counselling Network who had very different experiences on placement and training with peers maybe having that be an issue. But I was very, very fortunate to have trained with a really beautiful group of people who were really lovely and very open. But when I did my training, I worked in social care alongside that full time, and it was a real problem there. So I had anticipated that my age would be brought up a lot on training, in a way that I still experienced issues, I remember when I started placement, we started placement and I had sort of 2 locations. In one of those locations, I just got on with it myself. There was no placement manager there because that wasn't the permanent sort of residence. But in the other place where I did placement, the placement manager was always there. And I was really quite shocked to be introduced to all of my new clients, as the trainee young therapist. And my placement manager would actually come into the room with me and the client and then be like, this is Carley, she's new here, she's young, she's a trainee. When I then checked in with my peer supervision group and my other course trainees, they were like, no, that doesn't happen for any of us. So I had to speak to placement and say, like, why is that happening? And they were like, oh, we were worried that they would think because you're young and you look young, that you won't be as good. So we just have the manager come in and introduce you. And I was like, you're actually really massively undermining the process, because they're already coming in thinking, oh, why have we got somebody else in the room? Why has this person been introduced to me as new? It must be because she's not as good or not as competent or whatever. Whereas actually that's never been feedback that I've had from clients, but it was definitely like an awkward situation in placement to then say, please don't introduce me as young Carley or the new young trainee. It doesn't help the relationship building with clients.
It's not often I'm lost for words, Carley, but I am absolutely lost for words. And I was just, as you were telling me this, what went through my mind is I'm 64 at the time of recording this. If I went into placement, I wonder if the same practice manager would introduce me as old Rory. He's a bit old, but he's okay, and that is, I'm absolutely speechless. And how, the cliched question is, how did that make you feel to be kind of introduced in that way? You said it was undermining, but what was the underlying feeling around that?
I think it was hard. I felt immediately on the back foot, especially because I'd had the experience in the other training centre of starting with clients and not having that. But I think I was a little bit more hardened to it than I would be now, for example, where I work for myself and I interact with people who are younger. But I was a little bit hardened to it because I had worked in corporate environments where I was training, where my age always came up. I'd worked for public services. Like I said, I'd worked in social work. Whilst it was never an issue for the clients that I worked with, I repeatedly got feedback from families to say, she's too young. I don't want her working with my son or my child, or even though I worked with adults. Their families often felt like I wasn't going to be competent because I was younger. And that was never the case, actually. So I never took it too personally, because it was never that somebody had said, oh, she's done a bad job. But it also is difficult, I think, when you are trying to sort of forge ahead in an area that you really care about and are really passionate about. And you're already nervous, aren't you? You're starting placement, you're nervous. And it really felt like, oh, okay, that's immediately put something into the room that neither me or the client have brought into the room. So, yeah.
Absolutely. It sets up a completely different dynamic, doesn't it? Almost apologising for you because you're young. Yeah. It sounds like it. You spoke about reaction from, shall we say, in a broader sense, colleagues. And you touched a little bit on the reaction from your client group. In terms of your counselling experience, what has the reaction from your client group been?
I've never had it be a problem, ever, except for, actually, no, that's not true, except for one of the times on placement where the person introduced me. And at the end of the session, the person who I was working with decided not to work with me anymore because of my age. That's the only time that I've ever found it to be a negative. In terms of building relationships in other ways, it's either never been a problem, as in it's never come into the room, or it's been something now, particularly in private practice, where clients have actively said, I chose you because you look like you're the youngest person on the directory, or you look like you're somebody who is a similar age to me, and I wanted to pick someone who might understand my references. Or I think there's a lovely thing in being able to say, I understand, oh yeah, TikTok or, Instagram, or this new person that's come up, or this new album that's come out, and having an age group to work with where you can still understand it from their frame of reference, but when they say, "Have you heard the new Taylor Swift album?" you can be like, "Yes."
Yes, yes, and all these things, all these touchstones are part of building a relationship. I remember when I was a school counsellor, I took some advice from my then younger daughter, because we're talking quite a few years ago, and Facebook was the thing. And my very first client, when I sat down, sort of stared at me and kind of pinned me with her eyes and said, "Do you know about Facebook?" And I went, "Yes, I do." And she said, "Do you know what an inbox is?" Because they had inboxes then. That really dates me, doesn't it? And and the whole narrative was played through with the difficulties she was encountering on Facebook. And you're absolutely right. It gave a common currency and a common form of conversation. But I find it interesting that people chose you because of your age, and they thought they would have that connection with you.
Yeah, it's actually quite frequent feedback, particularly like if we're doing an ending. Then part of what I would do as an ending process in my own practice would be to think about how it was when they came to sessions and what was that like. And often it will come up then, people saying, I picked you for a reason. So I might not have known all the way through. And then they'll say, well, I picked you because I thought you looked similar age to me, and those kinds of things. So it is nice to have that, I suppose, freedom of choice a little bit more, that, as you say, more young people hopefully are stepping into it as a career. And hopefully that means that people can, if they want to, choose somebody that suits. I've also had perhaps older than me clients who have said, "Oh, I picked you because you're younger than me, because I thought that you would give me a completely fresh perspective." And whether or not I do provide that, I can't say. But what I can say is, again, it's about having that freedom of choice on a directory or who you pick, to pick someone who you think, "Oh yeah, they look, or they look like they might suit me." And that's something that I think's really important on a directory. That I know when I was looking before, when I was looking a few years ago, and even when I was looking recently in my local area, actually I was looking for anyone who might be within a sort of peer reference for me to work with. And I was like, I can't see anyone who looks anywhere near my age on this directory. So that freedom of choice, I think, is really important.
Yeah, I think that's interesting. So when you came to choose your own therapist, that was something that you were looking for, someone who may be in the same age group or demographic as yourself?
Yes and no. So it is definitely more recently played into my choices. But I think when I started, I was just looking for somebody who was even remotely closer to it's difficult, isn't it, to generalize, but I do think that there maybe is a slight difference in the acceptance of more modalities in the younger therapist community. I don't know about that, about what because I haven't experienced a huge amount of networking with older therapists, because I've actually I had some bad experiences, again, around my age. Lots of people assume that I work with children because of my age. Lots of prospective clients come to me and say, "Will you work with my child?" I don't work with children. But also lots of older therapists that I've spoken to have just immediately made the assumption that I work with children. And then we've gotten further into it and I'm like, "I don't work with children." And they're like, "But you're too young to work with adults." And so when you get that feedback, I guess I've stopped trying to network. I feel the feeling that comes up for me is that's really sad. I was initially speechless again at that, but I think that's really sad, because it's a discount, isn't it? It's discounting you because of just your age. You wouldn't have the experience to work with adults. I am sure that we're going to have a lot of younger therapists or those in training listening to you, and maybe they're sat at home, the listener is sat at home nodding their heads and saying, "Oh, this happened to me," or shaking heads thinking, "I hope it doesn't happen to me." What advice would you give younger therapists who are, up and coming? Maybe they're just starting their diploma training, ready to enter placement. Have you got any kind of wise words of encouragement or observation that you can share? No pressure.
No pressure. No pressure there.
Some wise words. I think remember that you're training the same as everybody else. Hold on to that. That it's not putting you as a I think there's this thing about life experience, isn't there? And assuming that because you're a certain age, you may have lacked life experience, or that that in some way that means that you won't be a good therapist. And we all have stuff that we're carrying. And actually, that's not ever, in my experience, been an issue. I've spoke to some wonderful young counsellors. I've spoke to some wonderful older counsellors. I've spoke to some older counsellors who I think I absolutely wouldn't practice like that. And I've spoke to the same for younger. Yeah. So I think, holding on to the fact that you're all doing your training, you're all working through it at the same time. My supervisor, I remember when it came up for me, said to me, this is their stuff. This isn't about your age and your incompetence, because otherwise we'd be having a different conversation as your supervisor. This is about their stuff. And also find other young counsellors to speak to. That was absolutely massive for me when I read in the BACP Talking Therapy magazine. Was it Therapy Today magazine?
Yeah.
The article from Ali and Charlotte saying that they were going to be setting up the network of young counsellors and psychotherapists. And I thought, yes, I've never come across anyone that's even remotely my age. I didn't know we existed. And then I suddenly fell into this group of wonderful, supportive people who were experiencing the same kind of challenges as me in training, trying to talk to people about how we make this a living when we care for our clients, was something that in placement and in training, it was like, well, you're all older, you're all third, second career counsellors, you've all got a supportive partner that pays the bills, you can afford to volunteer for years. And I was like, I can't. I've got to pay for a house and a mortgage. I'm starting off in my career.
Yes.
And actually, this lovely group of people were all experiencing the same thing. I remember I did a little talk for them about being a young counsellor. And I said, I'd found it really hard to figure out how to become a counsellor, particularly because when I left school, when I finished my A-levels at 18, I'd said to my psychology tutor, okay, I really want to become a counsellor. How do I do it? And he was like, I don't know, because none of the local training providers will take you at this age. You can't step onto a level 2 or level 1 or whatever. At 18, they won't take you. So you may as well go and do a degree, because I don't know how else you'll get there. And so actually, when I did that, I got loads of messages from other young counsellors saying, oh my God, me too. I didn't know how to go about it, or I was told I wasn't old enough to start training. And that community provided so much reassurance and support of like, actually, there's loads of people in the same boat. We aren't some small niche section that shouldn't be in the counselling community. We're just the same as everybody else.
Absolutely. And I think that, we spoke a little bit off air before we recorded the interview. And, I came across some research, I think it's from the BACP a few years ago, said the mean average of counsellors was about 50 years old. I would suspect that has changed. And I think maybe there's a whole other conversation about first careers in counselling, people who are coming to train and it's their first career, as opposed to maybe historically a lot of people who were doing it as a third career, or even when I started, people who were doing it as a rather well-meaning hobby to help people, which is a principal position, for someone who wants to help and is in the position to maybe work unwaged and to volunteer. And, it's not for me to it's not for me to comment on people's motivations, but you make a very good point that, of course, for a lot of younger therapists, this will be a first career. The graduates and a living needs to be made. I can't tell you what a delight it's been to speak with you, Carley, and I hope that if you are a younger therapist listening to this, that you take hope from Carley. You're in private practice now, Carley?
I am, yeah.
And you're forging ahead with your career. And I would say to you just finally, Carley Symes, thank you for joining us.
Big thank you to Carley. Big thank you to you, Rory. You do find us really interesting and informative interviews there. Very, very grateful for that. And of course, this has been the Counselling Tutor Podcast, episode 245.
Yes, and we started off with stages in counselling, just like stages in the podcast. There's a beginning, a middle, and hey-ho, we're at the end now. So we looked at stages in counselling. Then in Practice Partner, we looked at automation tools, those things that help you contact and connect with your client, but also the responsibility of managing data in an increasingly technological world of practice. Then finally, I caught up with Carley Symes on what's it like to be a young counsellor. Fabulous interview, and an inspirational. I think an inspirational person who is going to be the kind of at the forefront of how counselling develops through the years. And as always, stay grounded and stay safe.